A very happy and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Happy to meet all of you in this interesting webinar on navigating the SEBI cybersecurity and cyber resilience framework. In fact, this is such a unique framework, which for the first time as a regulator, they have come forward. And this is probably about 200 odd pages of legislation or set of a framework or a rules, which speaks across the entire SEBI fraternity, meaning all those REs or registered entities with SEBI shall be subject to compliance as far as this framework is concerned. That's the first and foremost requirement, right? So we'll go into the nuances of all of these as we speak ahead. And let me also remind you that this is a recorded session, so you'll be able to play back and look into some of these things whenever you wish to, and the links would be in the same channel. So quick brief about me. My name is Narsimhan Ilangovan. I'm a chartered accountant specializing in cybersecurity. And by passion, I am predominantly into the cybersecurity space, been consulting, advising, been an author, and as well as, helped various organizations in, this entire IT and cybersecurity space. So what are we going to look in today's conversation? Today's conversation will spend some time to understand the overview of this framework. And of course, we'll also look into some of the key changes which is there. And for whom is this applicable and some sense of timelines. And also I'll probably walk you through the entire framework so that you get an idea how this entire thing works. What is the approach typically people are following, or at least we are helping our clients with? What are some of the challenges and conclusions in this entire space, right? So that's basically how I want to navigate through. So let's quickly get started with the overview. And here, first and foremost, let us understand the reason or the broad structure of this framework. Just to bring it to context, since 2015, and 2015 is just for a reference because the multiple regulations have been coming across a different set of period. 2018 is where you will find a major set of regulations from SEBI coming into picture. But be that as it may, since 2015, SEBI has consistently issued a good number of cybersecurity and cyber resilience frameworks. And these are typically applicable for regulated entities. Please note, it is not applicable for listed companies. It is applicable for those entities which are registered with SEBI. An example could be a stockbroker, a mutual fund, an asset management company, an alter AIF, etc. Right? So that is one. Second, the whole purpose of this framework is to enhance the security measures, to give a sense of security against the rising threats, incidents, etc. Right? What happened earlier was SEBI's framework addressed specific needs. It was not focusing specifically on resilience. Resilience, especially after pandemic, all of us have realized the importance, right? In the August 20th, 2024, when this came up, it was understood that there is a need to consolidate all of these frameworks and to bring one sort of a master circular, like how RBI brings these master circulars. Something on those lines, it was understood it has to be brought. And that is where this entire thing has come to inculcate the sense of one framework across entities. Of course, when we listen throughout the conversation a little later, you'll realize there is some more flexibility possible in this particular framework is concerned. So a lot of those things, we will address it as it comes through. But yes, it is one framework to give a consolidated picture of the overall security posture, right? Hopefully that gives you some inputs as far as this particular topic is concerned. Now, what was the key difference between the old framework and the current framework? I'll probably give you a small gist for you to get an idea. The first and foremost was the focus of any of the earlier frameworks, 2015, 2018, whatever. It focused on certain specific players, and currently there are 4 to 5 players only where this framework had been initially issued. For example, the stock exchange, which I did make a mention, depository participants, mutual funds, all of these entities, this particular framework was applicable. But the 2024 literally includes all the registered entities, your venture capital funds called as the AIF, your credit rating agencies, your custodians who keep assets under custody, your demat and physical assets, gold assets, etc. Which means the 24 guidelines spares nobody. We'll of course look into each of these player names, right? First thing. Second, the earlier guidelines focused predominantly on cybersecurity, maybe a small amount on resilience. The 24 guideline focuses on resilience with these five broad pillars, which you can see: anticipate, withstand, contain, recover, evolve for a robust cybersecurity framework. And this is where, if you recollect those of who are experts in the ISO 27000 world, there is always this last point which focuses on continuous improvisation, right? Now, to a limited extent, one could probably see how that continuous improvisation is nothing but an extension or a reference to this word evolve for the so-called robust cybersecurity framework. Now, you might be saying, hey, I agree that this has been introduced for all the intermediaries, but don't you think it is little bit of an overkill? Meaning, you ask the entire world to follow one set of guidelines, irrespective of the size. I think we are trying to kill or over create certain challenges, which is right. And that is why something which I really like about this framework, it's a little challenging, but that is how the framework is it is enabled what is called a graded approach for any of these regulatory requirements. You heard me right, graded approach. Now, what does a graded approach refer to? It means based on the size and the risk probably they have categorized all the registered entities into five broad categories. MII, market institutions, infrastructure institutions. Then you have four categories of RE: qualified RE, mid RE, small RE, self-certification RE. So you have basically four different categories, right? And the bigger player, which is the MI. So these five categories, that means you have a bunch of registered entities. These registered entities will have to fit under any of these five categories. How do they fit in? We will look into it a little later. Now, this also talks about enhanced cybersecurity requirements. The 2018 circular probably focused on firewall, encryption, access, and for practical purpose, 2018 was when major amendments happened. 15 to 18, let us consider. So I call that as the 18 era and the 24 era, just for you to get the clarity. The 2018 focused on traditional measures like firewall, encryption, access controls. The 24 insists of very interesting thing. It focuses on mandatory SOC, Security Operations Center, mandatory Security Operations Center, 24/7 monitoring system for almost every category of registered entity. You have some exemptions if you follow what is called as a market SOC, which is set up by BSC or NSC. You get some amount of exemptions, but otherwise every other person will have to adhere to it. That's a very interesting and to a limited extent becomes an expensive move, but that is what it is. VAPT is mandatory in certain cases. Earlier it was optional. Of course, now they have mandated VAPT, and I'll take you through one of the slides. It is about vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. In case of you doing a very high sci-fi approach or hi-fi approach of using quantum computing, etc., then yes, you need to do a bunch of risk assessments there, right? And it also, for a very interestingly, talks about efficacy of evaluation of security. Now, this is a very interesting thing. It says it is not only sufficient if you are complying, I need to measure your efficacy. And a rating called as MII, right, has come up. Sorry, CII, beg your pardon. CCI, Cyber Capability Index, CCI, beg your pardon. This is an interesting framework or a yardstick of measurement, right? We'll speak about that as well. And last but not the least, anything you do, somewhere audit becomes mandatory, right? So there are requirements of mandatory cyber audits, which have to be done by certain empaneled vendors in most of the cases. And the biggest of the players, which is MII and the QRE, qualified registered entities, have to mandatorily undergo ISO 27001 certificate within a period of 1 year from the date the regulation is effective, right? So the regulation is effective on certain dates. We'll speak about that as well. The requirements of red teaming exercise, all of those which has to be performed. And the reporting also has been standardized, because earlier what used to happen, every organization had different formats. Today they've said that you need to report only in this format. I'll take you through some of them a little later. Now, what was the objective? Why did SEBI come up with this entire framework, right? First is obviously like any other regulator, I want to enhance, give some more flavor, give some betterment, right? And second is focus on resilience. Resilience is the ability to, bounce back even if there is a failure, having alternative mechanisms, or it could be as simple as having continuity plans. And more importantly, demonstrating that on an ongoing basis. Next, it also said I need to standardize cybersecurity practice across the vertical. Yes, you need to have certain things. How you do the internal nuances is left up to you. But yes, it is not sufficient if you just have a firewall. In certain cases, SOC becomes sort of mandatory. To promote a sense of risk management, in fact, policies, governance committee, technology committee, all of those things have been mandated. Encourage regular assessments, which is yearly, quarterly, or half yearly. Strengthen incident reporting, report to certain or any other players who has been notified in case any violations take place. And not to forget, ensure periodical compliance of this entire, the framework as such. So that's basically the objectives. Now, given the fact that you understood the objectives on one side, you also got reasonable clarity on, the difference between the old and the new. I think it's worthy that we spend some time to understand how this entire framework is structured. If you see very, very carefully, there is something called as resilience goals, which is written on top of it. This is the first biggest change you will notice. They have mentioned 5 resilience goals: anticipate, withstand, contain, recover, and evolve. 5 goals, right? These are called as the 5 resilience goals. These resilience goals have been merged along with the cybersecurity function, which is your governance, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Now, for those who have been in reasonably cybersecurity space, you would realize that the second bucket of the cybersecurity function has some sort of a common feature to an interesting framework, which is this. What is it? The NIST cybersecurity framework, NIST CSF 2.0. In fact, the 1.0, you can see the outer 5 elements being there. The 2.0, the major addition is the govern vertical coming into picture. And this govern, let me tell you, brought a new perspective. And this was also, when this was introduced, was benchmarked with the COBIT related frameworks, which the ISACA has come up with. Now, when SEBI came up with this framework, they benchmarked this framework with few other, including the certain guidelines of the India. They also looked into certain guidelines of NIST, NIST 800, etc. They also looked into guidelines which are provided from that perspective and came up with this broad pillar. So you will find the principle of evolve is across, the principle or the resilient goal of anticipate, withstand, contain, recover being for each of them. And under anticipate, broadly 4, which is governance, identify, protect, and detect. Under withstand and contain, respond. Under recover, recover. Right? So that's basically how this entire thing is divided. Now, if I have to go a little more deeper into each of them, what it deals with, we will come to it. But what is most important is the objective for each of them. The governance, the key objective is to establish and monitor risk cybersecurity management strategy. Now, this is where all your policies come into picture, your governance, your tone at the top, establishing the function of a security officer or the CISO, the board, the strategy, the rules, all of this come here. The second is where you have identity. This is mostly for you to assess, identify the assets, identify the risk, identify the inventory, facilities, system. It's more of you assessing after making a set of rules, whom do I actually target? The third is the principle of protect. Here is where what are the safeguards you are introducing to ensure that registered entities are able to have that element of resilience. Once you're focused on the protect pillar, you then focus on detect. It is more for you to identify, analyze, look at possible attacks, right? And this is where your SOC, monitoring, all of those comes into picture. And the moment you have that, what is it that you do next? Respond to it. What are the targeted actions? What are the procedures? What is it that you do to monitor and probably withstand and contain it? And last is recover. In case something happens, how do you restore? What were the services impacted? How are you able to bring up business resiliency, business continuity? All of this come into this particular ambit, right? So hopefully you got an understanding that how this entire landscape is actually designed, right? We'll go into some of these nuances as we get along, but I hope that gave you the perspective of this framework. The next thing which everybody asks is, hey, this framework is too large. Is it applicable for me? Who is it applicable for? Whether we like it or not, this applicability is across all the regulated entities. If you notice it very carefully, you have 19 broad categories which SEBI has mentioned as part as their applicability criteria. Starting from your AIF. Who are AIFs? Basically fund managers who are collecting money and investing into startups and all of those, right? So those are your venture capitalists, you can also call them as. Then you have banker to an issue, which is helping out in an IPO process, clearing corporation, which is helping out in your stock settlement, collective investment schemes, which is collecting money or equivalent and reinvesting for a particular objective, quite similar to a mutual fund, but not a mutual fund. Your credit rating agency, the CIBILs of not of individuals, but of organizations. So we call them as CRA. Custodians who have assets, debenture trustee in case there is a debt or a company has issued a bond, that institutions, right? Whoever is the trustee having that sort of an agreement, depositories who hold securities in electronic form, designated depository participants and depository participants, right? Then you have investment advisors who give advice registered with SEBI where to invest, where not to invest. You have your KRAs. KRAs are basically your KYC organizations, and probably these fellows will also be managing a lot of consent requirement under the data privacy law. Merchant bankers, mutual funds, right? And when you say mutual fund, it has a related party because fund is a trust at the end of the day that is managed by an AMC, asset management company. Then you have a portfolio manager who's managing a portfolio of, let's say, 50 lakh of corpus for an individual, registrar and share transfer agent when you're transferring the shares, stock brokers, stock exchanges, and venture capital funds, right? So this is a broad range of players for whom this guideline is applicable as we speak. So you might be saying, sir, if all of them is applicable at one shot, are there exemptions? Yes, we will be looking into it. But if you recollect, I also made a mention that not only it is applicable for all of these people, there is also something called as a graded approach. And that, my dear friends, for the very first time in the history, that a graded approach is fairly defined with a lot of thought process put behind it. The five broad categories of graded approach. First is market infra institution or infrastructure institution. These are people who provide the whole lot of infrastructure for the security market to operate. Now, this, my dear friends, is players like a stock exchange, right? Where shares are bought and sold. Then you have depositories who hold shares in a demat form. India has two depositories, NSDL and CDSL. In terms of stock exchange, the most active in terms of stock is obviously your BSE and the NSE, right? Third is a clearing corporation. In India, these are set up as subsidiaries of stock exchange. For all practical purposes, you can say the family of stock exchange. Then you have your KRAs, and then you have your QRTAs, qualified registrar or share transfer agent, right? So that's basically where we are talking of this entire bucket. Now, given this entire five pillars, which is market institution investors, now these five pillars or five stakeholders will always go under MII. The rest of the 19 persons we spoke on the previous slide, if they are not belonging to these five categories, will fit into the four which you see there. I repeat, the 19 stakeholders which we saw in the previous slide would fit into the four buckets other than MII. Ignore the MIIs because within the 19 also you have some MIIs. Remove them. All these 19 stakeholders, or probably some of them like stock exchange gets excluded, will be getting fit within this particular four categories. Now you might be asking, how do I fit them? Isn't it a complicated math, right? Yes, that is where this mechanism called as applicability comes into picture. Now, this is where for each of the categories, one should understand what makes a person applicable for. Just an FYI, don't compare blindly with this with the framework, because the framework starts from small to medium. I have, for all simplicity's sake, put it from large to small. That means starting from MIA going to the extreme left, which is the self-certification RE. Let's pick up first the AIF. AIF, who is 1,000 crore and above, go under qualified registered entity. Mid size is 500 to 1,000, small size is 100 to 500. Self-certification is less than 100 crores. This is based on AUM, and AUM is basically based on the market value. So you have the current market value. Let's say a fund has invested, right? And you will have to do whatever is your latest market value as of the 31st of March of the previous year. Consider that as a basis. Second, SCSB, Self-Certified Syndicate Bank. Interesting thing, here you need not specifically comply with these regulations because these are banks, and banks are already governed by RBI. So they need to submit the RBI compliance of cybersecurity framework to SEBI. That is enough for them, right? Third, stockbrokers. Entire thing, like stockbrokers are like the Zerodha or your HDFC Securities, Axis Securities, ICICI Securities, where you actually through them you buy the shares. Now, if you're doing it, or if it is a stockbroker, right? Remember, for them these regulations are already applicable. It's not that today they have to follow it. It is already applicable for them. But having said that, for these stakeholders, if they have more than 5 lakh UCCs, and UCC stands for unique client code, right? So how many codes am I maintaining for one client? See, I can have 3-4 demat accounts, but my unique client code will only be one. It is something like, customer ID in case of banks. So those of you who have been in the banking space, you will be able to recollect that I can have multiple accounts, but my customer ID is just one. So the same way here, we focus on active client base, or the UCC. If it is more than 5 lakh clients or 500,000, you fall under qualified. 50 to 500,000 is mid-size. 10,000 to 50,000 is small size. Anything less than 10,000 would go under self-certification RE. There could be a scenario that this person or the stockbroker is also providing what is called as algorithmic trade. In such event of providing algorithmic trade, by default, you come under the small size RE or any other upper categories. That means the lowest category is not fit for you. Algorithmic trade is basically trade facilitated by use of algorithms, which has automated buy, automated sell, and things like that. Then you have two other smaller set of stakeholders, CIS and CRA. They fall under self-certification RE. One could always ask, hey, why given them very lot of exemptions? Remember, these are agencies or organizations who, at the end of the day, have comparatively lesser personal information and individual data compared to the other stakeholders. Credit rating agency is not agencies which rate individuals like you and I, but rate organizations. So they obviously have some amount of data, but they've been given this particular privilege. Next is custodians. Custodians is all based on asset under custody. Like earlier, it was asset under management. Here it is asset under custody. If it's 10 lakh crores, then we talk of qualified. If it's mid-size, we're talking about 1 lakh to 10 lakh crores. Small size, we're talking about less than 1 lakh. There's no concept of self-certification over here. A debenture trustee mostly goes only as a self-certification RE because he's just a trustee and there's not much of technology or environment which he has to showcase, and therefore it goes based on this. And this is typically for a new issuer of a listed debt security. If they have a new issuer of a listed debt security as their client in the last 3 financial years, otherwise they've been given some exemption, right? Very interesting. Next is depository participants. It is based on the type of DP. If you are an institution, qualified. If you are a non-institution, you go under mid-size, right? That's a very simple thing. Then you have designated depository participants. Here it is based upon similar to above. Either you call under, based on the custodians, etc. You fall under those two buckets. You have investment advisors. If it's an individual, you are upfront given an exemption. If you are non-individual, you are treated as small size RE. Research analyst, again, it depends upon what category under which you have registered with SEBI. Research analysts have different categories. So there, based on that, you will probably get classified under QRE, mid-size or small RE, right? So that's basically where it is. Next is your KRA, KYC registered agencies. So KRA are, typically fall under MII. So for them, the highest set of rules will be applicable. Then you have merchant bankers. It depends on what category or what legal position they have. If they are a part of a systematically important financial institution, such as a bank or a financial institution, etc., then they fall under qualified. Otherwise, they may fall under mid-size or small size. Then you have mutual fund and asset management company. Again, based on the size, 1 lakh crores, 10,000 crores, less than 10,000 crores. Portfolio managers, this is basically who are managing PMS, popularly called as. If it's more than 3,000 crores, come under mid-size, 1,000 to 2,000 small size, less than 1,000 self-certification. RTA, remember, qualified registered to an issue. It is now based on folio numbers, right? A folio is like equivalent to the units or a particular page, right? Just like how we say a page, right? In a security market, there's a folio. So here it's small size, mid size, and MII, depending upon the category or the size at which you're dealing. And last is your VC. This is again based on your amount which you're dealing, quite similar to the AIF definition, right? So the first thing which any person will have to do under this framework is figure out where they fall under. Only after that, the entire compliance journey starts, and this chart will give you some bit of guidance. It's also available in the SEBI framework, as I made a mention. There are some exclusions where they have given that this is not applicable. For example, a foreign portfolio investor, a foreign venture capital, right? Individual investment advisors, etc. RTA who's servicing less than 10,000, vault managers, REITs, investment REITs, all these players, it's currently not applicable. Exclusion is provided. Then comes the bigger question to all of you, right? What are the timelines for implementation, right? What are the timelines for implementation? Because this is the critical milestone. This timeline or the compliance deadline was January 1, 2025. We are already 25 days late. If you are thinking that we should consider implementing now, it's quite late. But having said that, our SEBI has come up with a relaxation, which I'll speak about in a few minutes. This deadline is for all registered entities where there is a sense or a regulation already in place. So this framework came up in August. If you already had a framework on these lines, probably the old framework to the new framework, you only had to migrate. So therefore, it gave probably about 4 months, where January 1, 2025 became the deadline. And who are these players? As I said, market institutions, stockbrokers, mutual fund, KRAs, QRTAs, and portfolio managers. On the other hand, the compliance deadline is for April 1, 2025 for any other SEBI regulated entity. An example is given there. Now, what happened is in the last week of December, SEBI came up with a relaxation. It said that this compliance deadline of January 25 shall be read as March 31st, 2025, as long as you are able to show some steps have been actually been implemented for this particular phase or adhering to these guidelines. In fact, they have not said that this is not applicable or deferred. They use the word regulatory forbearance. That means the regulator shall bear the fact that you have not complied as long as you're able to prove that you're doing some actions to comply. So that's basically possible. So technically, you get that benefit for all these players. Only for depository participants and KRA, SEBI felt that it should be synchronized with the other stakeholders. Therefore, their original deadline from January 1 becomes April 1, 2025. That's only for depository participants, not for stockbrokers. Only for depository participants, not for stockbrokers, and for KRAs, it gets extended to April 1, 2025. So technically, you still have about two months and maybe 5 days, right? So technically, that's the effective period you have for implementation. Now, how does the framework look like? Because everybody would then ask a question, okay, all this is great. What does the framework sound like? So the framework broadly has got 4 categories, apart from executive summary, context, and all those. The first one is about objectives and standard. Now, this is where very interesting. They have defined the based on the framework, which I did make a mention some time back. The objectives highlight what is the goal, what is the security function, what you need to accomplish, and how do you do that is given under details in guidelines. And this guideline may have a one-to-one or one-to-many mapping with the objective. So this is where it becomes a little clumsy affair, but one has to spend some time, and it's a question of time how you are able to map that. So the guidelines recommend all the measures which are required. Some of the guidelines are mandatory, some of them are optional, but whichever is mandatory, you don't have an option, but you will have to adhere to it. Part 3 and Part 4 are purely about formats, annexures, and cross references. It's a good thing to probably go through it, but probably, we will navigate the framework so that you get some idea. So Part 1, objective standard. Part 2 is about guidelines. Now that you got an idea about this framework, I would like to remind you how the NIST CSF 2.0 looks like. The NIST CSF 2.0 has these broad functions, what you see on the left-hand side: govern, identity, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And each of them have something called as gv.oc, gv.rm, gv.rr. That is governance, organization context, governance, risk management, governance, roles and responsibility, right? And governance, oversights, everything. On similar lines, you will also find it with the SEBI framework. right? It may not be in this colorful approach, but it does have something similar to this, right? Of course, the SEBI framework may not exactly be under the same approach. For example, this risk assessment, right, is not given in the SEBI framework, does not come under identity, but rather comes under governance, and it is called as risk management rather than risk assessment, right? It's again the structural presentation and some bit of a cosmetic change basis the requirements or which has been followed over here. Now, how does the framework look in when it comes to Indian context? This is how it is. If you recollect, you have already seen the top few pillars, which is your resilience goals and functions. We'll spend some time to understand each of them, right? So governance is, as I said, focuses on few domains starting from organization context. One would relate it to your ISO requirements, the importance of organization context, right? It's all about size, it's all about the transactions, who are your customers, what are your regulatory requirements, what are your responsibilities, contracts, SLAs, etc. That boils down to roles, responsibilities, and authorities, definition of that. Policies, cybersecurity policy, your access policy, your data policy, cloud management policy. Of course, they have not mentioned what is the list of policies you require. You get to define that, but those should be essential. Then, of course, how are you bringing that oversight, including the board reporting, right? Risk management. If you remember, I told you that RM, which was not there in the previous, right? If you notice over here, it just has supply chain security risk management. Whereas here you have specifically on risk management, and then you have the cyber security supply. So it's not exactly a NIST framework. No doubt a benchmark is done from there, and certain components have been realigned based on the requirements here. Then comes the element of identity. If you remember, I told you identity in the NIST framework focus on asset, risk, and improvisation. Here it's a little different. Here it focuses on asset management and risk assessment, which is obviously an exercise. So the risk management comes under governance. Risk assessment comes in identity. In other words, your policy relating to risk, how it should be updated, how it should be reported is focused on governance. How you measure the risk, your risk registers, your periodical monitoring, testing, all of those comes under the principle of or the function of identity. Then comes protect, which is quite similar. If you notice, it talks about predominantly one large section, which is identity management and authentication, and of course, identity authentication access. Then you have awareness and training, basically how well you are able to inform, get people to be aware of all these elements. Then the principle of data security, principles of encryption, etc. Information protection processes, procedures, maintenance, right? Periodical maintenance and update. So that comes under the protect vertical. Then you have the fourth vertical, detect. This is all about continuous monitoring and some sort of an analysis, right? So this is where your security continuous monitoring, what is the mechanism which is going to come up? The SOC. And I told you SOC has been made mandatory, right? Irrespective of the size, it has become mandatory, but you have certain privileges if you're using market SOC. We'll come to that a little later. And what is the process to detect that, right? So that's basically what it is. And then you have withstand and contain. This, or rather respond, if I have to speak from a function perspective, this is where your incident management becomes very important, right? And measure, how do you measure the efficacy of incident management? Those also comes into picture. Your reporting protocols, your incident analysis, improvisation, the entire bucket is there. And last is recovery, that incident recovery, how are you doing it? How are you communication? What are your improvisation? In fact, respond and recover to a large extent focus on incident management, getting it into order, and how are you able to run the show and report and able to restore and go ahead, right? So that's basically what the broad perspective. I'll pause for a minute if there are any questions which has come through. I know it's been a little more than about 40 odd minutes. We had a lot of interesting talks on the applicability, etc. I'll pause for a minute just to take some questions, and then probably I will take the conversation here. When institution is having both banking and trading, will it be governed by RBI or SEBI? The answer is both. Your RBI requirements are governed that side, your SEBI requirements are governed here. Generally, what happens? The SEBI license is for a separate entity. Like for example, if you say ICICI Bank and ICICI Securities, ICICI Securities would be a separate legal entity. That legal entity will be governed by SEBI, whereas the bank is governed by RBI. That's how the relationship is. Okay, so since there are not many questions, I think I'll take the conversation ahead as to how this is actually in the context of the SEBI regulations. And these wordings, can you see GVOC, GVRR, GVPO? You could probably correlate with what you notice over here in the extreme corner category identifier. Are you able to see this? Right in the NIST framework, I'm just trying to give you a correlation, how it is easy for you to look at it. On similar lines, you will find the GV vertical, then your ID vertical, your PR is your protect vertical, you have your detect vertical, respond and recover, right? So that's basically how it actually works through. Now, what I thought I will do, I'll give you a quick perspective of how this works in a very simple tabular format, because I didn't want to put this into the slides because it becomes too much for any person to look into too many tables. So I'll just give you some perspective of what each of them focuses on so that you get an idea about it. Just give me a minute. I'm quickly going to navigate into another window. Please confirm if you are able to see this screen as well, which is a spreadsheet. Just give me a minute. Yes. This is a spreadsheet where you're able to see, and I've just made a very simplified example of how it looks like. Then I'll take you through the standard so that you're able to get an idea, right? So the GV, as I said, if you recollect in this particular slide, we focused on organization context, roles and responsibility, policy, oversight, risk management, supply chain. This is just an example for you, right? What is the sub requirement or explanation? Establishing roles and responsibilities. Now, this is where your charter, your roles, responsibilities, accountability becomes very important. How do you do that is all given in the details in the guideline, right? Next comes your roles and responsibilities. This includes designation of a specific person. Then you have policy, which talks about the entire framework. Then we speak about oversight, including how the boards are kept updated. Very interesting. This should now become a board agenda, mandatory, right? Risk management, how the entire framework of risk management comes into picture, how they're continuously reviewing it, what standards they're following. And then comes the element of supply chain related elements. Remember, many of these organizations are using third-party softwares or solutions. So it is mandatory to do some of these assessments even for such third-party institutions, right? Keep that in mind. So that's as far as the governance is concerned. Then comes the principle of identity. So if I could quickly jump into ID dot, right? It talks about asset management and risk assessment. Asset management is creating inventory, updated assets, software, service, maintenance, regular reviews. And then you have risk assessment, which talks about simulated environments, scenario-based testing, internal, external, tabletop exercise, doing those periodical assessments for you to get that visibility as well, right? So that's also another exercise for identity. Then the third pillar is protect. You've identified, you need to protect it, right? So your protection detection comes into picture. So let's quickly go to the next pillar, which is PR, protect and detect, just for you to remember the context, governance, identity, and then you protect it, right? So how does the protection function work? It talks about identity and access, things like your MFA, your multi-factor, your VPN connectivity, your access privileges, grants need to know. The whole bucket of your access privileges comes there. Then your awareness and training, this is all about your phishing drills, simulations, right? So for those organizations who are probably just doing awareness, you need to go much more deeper, including phishing drills, right? Awareness initiatives. Then comes elements of protecting data, right? Encryption, how you're actually focusing on that, production data, non-production data, how the data from production environment to moves to the non-prod, right? Things like that comes into picture. Then your protection of the process and procedures. This is more to do with your, your secure software development guidelines, SDLC, if I could probably call it as. Then comes the element of maintenance, right? Maintenance focuses on, sorry, this comes under detect. So I think I'll probably skip that. I think I just used the short form to pick this up, right? So that comes your protection element. The maintenance will focus on conducting periodical audits, right? So that's basically where the PR vertical comes. Then comes your DA, which is your detect vertical, right? So let's see how the DA vertical actually evolves, right? And DA is mostly to do with your data security and continuous monitoring process, right? So your monitoring process and your data security comes under the DA vertical. And then you have RS. RS talks about respond. If you have identified an issue, how do I respond to it? Your incident management, I remember I told you the last two verticals is mostly to do with incident management, response and reporting and communication. Then is your analysis and what have you done to improvise. So this is where your root cause analysis, how you deal with it. Are you having forensic analysis to be performed in case there was a cyber attack? What is it that you do? A lot of emphasis has gone into this particular vertical. And the last being RC, right? Which is the recover, which is, are you able to recover from a particular fall or an issue, which talks about incident recovery, incident plan, communications, and improvisation. So hopefully I gave you a very, very bird's eye view of the broad things which is there. As I said, this Excel sheet, what I showed you, is a very simplified version. I would not say that this is what the framework is, just a simplified version for you to get a bird's eye view perspective. If you keep on going into each of these elements, you get much more details into all of those, right? So hopefully that gave you a good starting point for you to look into it. How does SEBI expects firms to report incidents? There are two methods. It depends on who your regulator are. Certain cases like stockbrokers have to inform to SEBI, to the stock exchange. All other players have to make an intimation to SEBI, irrespective of the certain requirement. Certain has a different set of requirements. So which means if an incident, data breach, etc., certain you still have to report it. Whereas here you will go ahead and report it to the regulator such as stock exchange if you are a stockbroker. All other cases, I think you'll have to go to a SEBI, right? Even a depository participants also have given that privilege where they can go report to stock exchange. One other thing people ask me, hey, all these guidelines are okay, but what is that key new things, key challenges or the key components, right? Because the framework, I always have policy, I always have this, that, etc. What are some of the key things which is there? And that's where I thought I'll focus specifically on certain key elements, right? For the first time, they have gone ahead and defined if you're using a hosted service means any person's service which is hosted in a SaaS environment or even somebody else's data center. If you're using a hosted service, you need to mandatory follow all of this, right? What is it? First, data center standard. The data center where your SaaS solution or your hosted entity is having should be a tier 4 equivalent or should be a TIA 942 rated. These are resilience measures of data centers, right? It should have a fault tolerance and redundancy for all components. That's the first requirement. Second, if you're using, the IT infra standards, they should, if they're hosted on the cloud, they need to mandatorily meet the MITI empanelment requirements for cloud service providers, which means now if you are a stockbroker or a market institution, you're using a third party services, that third party has to meet these requirements, right? It should be audited by STQC empanel cloud audit organizations, right? or equivalent international agencies. Again, certain requirement guidelines come into picture. A VAPT is mandatory. That VAPT has to be submitted to the registered entity. Remember, I'm not talking about the registered entity. I'm talking about a registered entity using the services of a third party or a hosted service. It can include even a SaaS solution, right? So summary of report must be available to our registered entity. Then comes the element of data localization. If the data center is outside of India, right, you need to maintain a copy of the data within India. However, they have given a relaxation for this particular requirement of data localization until further orders. This came in the extension circular, so we'll have to wait for that. Kill switch prohibition, right? There should not be any solution which can kill or delete everything from a remote location, right? So that's a very, very interesting provision. So admin or the kill or the delete all access should not be there. And you need to clearly have a responsible demarcation. What in the cloud world we call it as the shared service responsibility, right? Who should be the technical, who should be the managerial, who should be the governance initiatives. Responsibilities explicitly in the agreement has to be defined. And they also say, please refer they also said, please refer to the framework of cloud services for SEBI regulated entities. So you will also have to adhere to that as well. So those are few requirements which has come up from a hosted service provider, and the hosted service provider is any person, which could also mean a SaaS solution or a SaaS provider, right? Hopefully I have clarified that thing. For SEBI, is there a requirement to report to CERT? That's an internal protocol between two regulators, because SEBI is a regulator. So here we are not talking about reporting to CERT or etc. Incident reporting, you still have to report it after the commencement of these regulations to your first level intermediary regulator or SEBI. As I said, stockbrokers will have to inform it to stock exchange. All other players will have to inform it to SEBI. Whereas irrespective of this, the certain guidelines, you will have to adhere to that. For reporting the incident, at this point, we do not have any specific timeline mentioned, but is generally is between 48 hours to 72 hours. If you look into the DPDP, the rules, I think it makes a mention of around 72 hours. Okay. Now, what is this mandatory VAPT, and in what circumstances you have to do a mandatory VAPT? This is just an example or an illustrative list, right? First, when you are implementing any new SEBI circular, they say you have to do a VAPT. So which means this circular you're implementing for first time, so please get a VAPT done. Second, changes in core versions of the software, your .NET, your SQLs, your Oracles, Java, if they're having some serious upgrades, mandatory VAPT. Any changes in policy of login password management, it is mandatory. Why? Because there is a possible for a scamster to probably come and attack into the system. Significant system modifications that are altering the exchange of data, right? Stock exchange, the formats, etc. Those are also treated as significant modifications. Introduction of new security protocols. You moved from your TLS 1.2 to 1.3, go ahead and do a VAPT, right? Expansion into new financial markets, adding currency trading, adding a new product, get your VAPT done. Implement of a new schema, new process. Let's say stock exchange tells all the brokers going forward, you have to use a different format or a schema for upload. My goodness, you'll have to get a VAPT done. So the scope of VAPT has expanded significantly. And in fact, there is a VAPT reporting format as well. So those of you who are pen testers and listening to this conversation, my dear friends, your game is only going to expand with more requirements, right? Likewise, the cyber audits and other things as well. Few other requirements I spoke of: data classification and localization. This is where I said REs are required to classify two categories: regulatory data and IT cybersecurity data. For the first time, they've come up with a very unique definition. Regulatory data are what you have from a regulator perspective, periodical reporting, customer data, all of those. IT cybersecurity data is all about your logs, your access logins, your times, your sock knock, all of those comes into picture. RE are required to store regulatory data in an easily accessible, legible, usable form within the legal boundaries of India. As I said, this is where exemption or relaxation has been provided for certain period, considering the DPDP is going to also talk about localization to some extent, right? Then there is a requirement of API security, right? Application program interface. So API security and endpoint security solution shall be implemented with rate limiting, throttling, and proper authentication. So you can imagine that this also requires a monitoring. What is the frequency of API calls, right? What is the throttle rate? What is the authentication mechanism? All of those has to be defined. The third thing is a security operations center. It mandates all REs, look at the word, all REs establish appropriate security mechanism, operating mechanism through a SOC, right? Now this SOC, you can have your own SOC, you can have a group company SOC monitoring you. Say for example, for ICICI group of institutions, ICICI is having that, right? You can have a third party managed SOC, or you can have a market SOC. A market SOC is a SOC from a NSC or a BSC where they have to have their own market SOC. It's also called as MSOC. Currently, BSC or NSC, I think they have notified who is an MSOC. You can visit their website, you will get those details. You can have a tie-up with them and set up that entire infrastructure, right? So that's on your security operations center. To me, sometimes it looks slightly like an overkill for a smaller players, but I think we don't have an option. But good thing is if you're using market SOC, a lot of these requirements are reduced. So that's how probably you can make a advantageous position of it. Next, for a very, very interestingly, they have come up with what is called as software bills of material or bill of material, right? So you would have heard of a bill of material in a different context, right? In an engineering context, bill of material talks about for manufacturing a component, what are each of the sub-components necessary? Now imagine from a software terminology, a software bill of material is nothing but a record which contains the entire supply chain relationship, components used. You might be using an open source, you might be using certain other websites. How are you bringing all of this together? It is a record of that. So if you are using your own software, you have to maintain this. If you are using a vendor solution, ask the vendor to give the SBOM. In October 2024, Certain has updated some guidelines on SBOM. It is a worthwhile document for you to look into. I think 40-50 pages document. Certain SBOM, if you go type it, you will get it. It talks about the detailed setup as to how you need to do this. These SBOM has to be assessed by the cyber auditors, remember that, and this has to be reported for critical infrastructure, and now it's a mandatory requirement. So REs have to maintain a copy of this SBOM, right? It could be your relationship, components, whatever we speak of. Next, very interestingly, they have come up with what is called as CCI, Cyber Capability Index. Now, this is applicable for MII. This is applicable for qualified REs as well, right? So that means the top two categories. Only difference is MII has to be subject to an audit on a yearly basis, or I think twice a year. Whereas qualified RE, I think it has to do on a self-certification base. That's the only difference. So this has to be calculated. What are the parameters? I'll take you through. The whole purpose is to measure your resilience and compare your maturity. To give an example, it talks about one of the components is security training awareness. How much percentage of people in your organization have security training awareness completed divided by the number of people in your organization? So if you say that everybody have completed, great. If you say 60% have completed, that becomes the score as far as that particular pillar is concerned. Now for each of these pillars, they have given a weightage. We'll speak about that in a few minutes from now. But what is the purpose of this? It is helping organization to understand cybersecurity risk. It highlights where there is an area of improvisation. It can optimize resource allocation, and it can demonstrate SEBI compliance and regulations, right? So that's basically how the CCI helps a lot of these organizations. Now, given this setup of how CCI helps these organizations with these buckets, it is also important that you understand what constitutes or how CCI is actually made. This is a simple chart which I picked up from that framework. I had to read up about good 15 to 20 odd pages to summarize this, right? But yes, it talks about multiple factors and the weightage percentage. The cumulative of this weightage is 100, just for you to give an example, right? I'll talk about each of them for you to get an idea. Let's say security budget. So what is the security budget granted to the organization and how those parameters, they've given few things. Now, basis that you have to give a score, right? There is a ratio. So let us say you get 20 points as an example. 20 points is multiplied into this 8% for you to get that weightage. So if you have got 100 in that particular security weightage, then your overall CII score is 8 as far as the security budget is concerned. So you will keep on adding each of them. Let's take an example, vulnerability mitigation. The yardstick is how many vulnerabilities are identified, how they've been mitigated, reported, etc. So let us say your base is, let us say, identified vulnerabilities example is 100, of which, let us say, you have mitigated 80% or 80 of them. So 80 divided by 100, 80% is your score in vulnerability mitigation. But for your overall CI score, 18% weightage only that will be given. So 80 into 18, whatever that number is, that is your score as far as this is concerned. So it's going to be a little bit of a mathematics game, but that is where we can't do much about it. If you have implemented multi-factor authentication for all your devices, you easily get that 3% score. Network segmentations you have performed, 3 networks have segmented out of 5 networks, so 3 upon 5 into 3%. So things like that come into picture. If you are ISO 27001 certified, you get the balance 2%, right? If you have an automated compliance monitoring system with CSCRF, right? That's an interesting thing. Then you have another 5%. So things are quite interesting. Lot of companies are going to come up with innovative solutions because it is impractical that you will be probably remembering each and everything, right? So we'll have to see how it matures. But that is where we speak about the CCI. CCI is applicable at this point only for MII and qualified RE, right? So for these two people, CCI is mandatory, right? ISO certification also mandatory for CCI and QM. Now, this is how a maturity is looked at. If you are 90 plus, you are an exceptional organization. But if you are less than 50, you fail. And which means if you have failed, you need to have answers ready because SEBI is going to be questioning you, right? If you're 60 to 51 to 60, it means you have bare minimum security. 61 to 70, you are in developing. 70 to 80, SEBI says is manageable. 81 is where SEBI says you are optimal. And 91 is you are an exceptional organization, right? So that's basically how the rating is. Very interestingly, I was seeing the certificate requirement. It says the certifier, whoever is certifying, he is verified and he agrees to the rating of what this is, right? So it's interesting. There's an obligation even on the person who is certifying this, right? So that's where the CCI is coming into picture. Now, the last requirement is on the key compliance. Who needs to follow when? I'll quickly take you on this, and last I will navigate through the framework, and also I'll talk about how you should go about in a given situation, right? How one should navigate it. At this point, there are no tools or Excel solutions. Maybe ISACA or maybe SEBI itself will come up with some framework. Let's see. But at this point, this is where it is, right? So first you pick up the key requirement. Now, first thing is on CCI, I told you, which we just spoke in the previous slide. MII should do a half yearly, and for QRE, it is annually. Only difference is for QRE, you can do a self-certification. For MII, you have to get it certified by a cyber auditor. And who is a cyber auditor? I told you, a certain auditor. Cybersecurity and cyber resilience policy and risk management annually review for everybody. End of story. Right? You need to have a cybersecurity policy, resilience policy review, and it is not creating a policy. You need to implement it, practically check it. That is what the role of the auditor also is going to be. IT committee with at least one external independent expert on cybersecurity, and this IT committee quarterly should have a meeting for MII, qualified RE, and mid-size RE. Interesting. So be ready, those of you who are senior folks, you have consultant opportunities over here with registered entities, and it is applicable even for mid-size RE. So you have an opportunity there, right? RE threat-based risk assessment. This is where I told you the risk assessment, which is the second pillar. We focused on governance. We focused on identity, right? In identity, there was asset identification and risk assessment. This has to be done quarterly based on risk-based scenarios. Next, a very simple control, which they have insisted you have to mandatorily do: user access review, delegated access, unused tokens review, etc. This has to be performed on a quarterly basis, mandatory for MIA or QRE. Others, good practice to follow. Review of privileged user activities, quarterly, half yearly for all of them. So there is no way in which you can escape. So tomorrow, if anybody says, why should I review privileged user activity, which is the most common issue which auditor and auditee faces, tell them that, hey boss, there is a regulator itself who's saying this mandatory, and very soon it might come to other people as well. Cybersecurity training, I think it's annually, a simple thing. Efficacy of your SOC. Your SOC here refers to your Security Operations Center. How effective is this particular SOC, and are you able to manage this? This has to be done on a half-yearly basis for MIA and QRE. For the other three, this should be done annually, right? Red teaming, mandatory only for the biggest of the two, which is half-yearly, where you try to do some bit of a threat hunting and all of those things, right? Of course, threat hunting is a separate exercise. Quarterly basis, they've insisted for MIA and qualified RE. ISO 27001 within 1 year of implementation, mandatory for MII and qualified RE. VAPT at least once a year or twice a year, depending on the changes, etc. It's mandatory. And cyber audit, which I made a mention, twice a year. So which means the certain auditor has to audit twice a year, qualified RE twice a year, mid-size and small size, it is once a year. Only if you're doing an algo-based trade, it is actually once a year. And that is why self-certification RD do not have these requirements. Do not have these requirements. So remember that if you do not have those requirements, you are actually sort of free or exempt from a self-certification, but compliance is still required. So I'll quickly take you through the navigation of the framework, but before that, I see some questions coming in the chat. Let me quickly take that. So time frame of incident, I think I addressed. Typically, it will be about 72 hours, but we'll have to see how the guidelines. Is it applicable for all IT or limited to IT infra? They used only for DP. I am not sure, Gururaj, if you can clarify in what context you're speaking, because your question was asked some time back. If we adopt the NIST framework and deploy it on our cloud resources hosted on public cloud, would it baseline address all aspects of CSCRF? Sharath, maybe a good percentage it will be addressed, but there are smaller nuances which this framework has. Example, software bill of material. Then you have SEBI's own guidelines on how cloud security provider has to be taking care from a security perspective, right? The NIST may or may not focus specifically on data localization, whereas the CSCRF is speaking about it. So it is a good start, but I think an independent assessment of the CSCRF is mandatory. VAPT to be done for all IT assets or infrastructure or used for SEBI purpose. They use a definition of critical assets and non-critical assets. Critical assets every year, non-critical assets at least 25%. That is what is the scoping they have mentioned in one of the paragraphs. So you can probably look into it, Gurraj, so that will give you some clarity. From a SEBI, are there any non-compliance out of VAP open finance? What is the penalty each day, each month? No, no penalty as of now has been mentioned. But I think it will be mostly focused from how you are approaching it, right? Now, let us say you have a quarterly compliance and you are doing the VAPT only in the last quarter. It is something which you will have to change your sequence, right? So if you have an audit report which you're submitting quarterly basis, so beginning of the quarter or the previous quarter, make sure you do a VAPT, right? So that you at least have time to redress it. So by the time you submit to SEBI, it is clear that 3 out of 5 vulnerabilities have been resolved. 2 have been kept on for whatever reasons. And these are the countermeasures taken to prevent this particular attack from taking place. So if you have that risk management approach and methodology, Santakumar, it should be able to give you some idea. Okay. So what I will now do is I'll take you through this heavy piece of literature. Do not panic. Even if you panic, I cannot do much, right? That is how this circular is. Because I believe in giving you or giving an explanation as to how to fish rather than just happily giving you the fish ready made to you, right? So I'll give you a perspective how you should or one should look into it. Give me 1 minute. I'm going to quickly share another window. Screen share, PDF document, and yes, share this. Hopefully you're able to see this particular PDF document. This is your August 20 circular, which we are speaking of, right? August 20, 2024, the circular. And if you notice here, all the parties appear, and note here, this is 205-page document. So don't get overwhelmed by it. I know it is a little difficult, but be that as it may, that's how it is. It gives you some overview about initial pages. Let's not go into too much of that. These are the 5 broad goals which I mentioned from this particular framework, and this is taken from your your cyber crisis management plan, etc. And these are the 5 security functions. So what you see on top is the 5 goals. These 6 what you see is the resilience goals. 5 is your sorry, 5 is the resilience goals and 6 is the cyber security functions. Okay. Now these are the 5 players which we spoke of: MII, QRE, mid-size, small size, and self-certification. And this is the structure. If you remember, I told you part 1 is objective standard, part 2 is guideline, part 3 is formats, part 4 is annexures, references, how CCI is calculated, efficacy of SOC we spoke of, right? So we'll not go into each of these elements, but I'll quickly tell you where you will have to navigate, right? So if you see, the entire framework starts off from the annexure, which is there in page number 11. You go down a little further, some executive summary definitions are given, but not too much. But I'll probably take you through the contents, right? So first you will find in point number 2 or serial number 2 or whatever that is called as, right? Bullet point 2, etc. Thresholds for RE categorization. This is where one should be able to navigate the entire framework, each component, what is applicable. Then he speaks about IT committee. I told there is 2 committees, right? On IT committee, how you will have to mandatory have that, especially for the external expert is also required for all of these. Then the 4th section talks about certain timelines definition, something which I just made a mention of. All of those are covered over here. Now, this is where your part 1 starts, right? Now, part 1, if you notice, it talks about resilience goal, anticipate, cybersecurity function, governance. So anticipate is across, just for you to refresh your memory in that chart which we spoke of, right? This anticipate is across the pillar. Governance, you have identity, protect, etc. Right? So keep that in the back of your mind. So GV, what you see is governance. OC, RR, PO, all of these are particular organization roles and responsibility policy. Now, what is given in GVOC in part 1, if you scroll down, you'll also find that appearing in part 2, right? If I go to part 2, I'll of course take you through. I'm not going to take you through each one of them. I'm just giving you one example. So if I go to the first framework on anticipate, right? This is what you will find. Resilience goal, evolve, right? The cybersecurity function is anticipate, because this resilience goal evolve is across, remember that it is across, so don't bother too much about it. Anticipate and governance, and this are GVOC, GVRR, GVP, GV oversight. That is the points which we saw, right? And if you notice over here, it talks about first objective and what the standard is. Then it talks about RR, objective and the standard. Then again talks about policy, objective and the standard, right? So that's how one should look at it. Now, the moment you have gone through this, this does not end the story. What you'll have to do is go back to the contents. Contents, I think, was in page number 30. No, slightly above that. Right? So we spoke of GVOC, right? Now, for this GVOC, right, I'm quickly going to navigate and take you through the CSCRF guidelines. So remember, for each of this GVOC, there is a specific guideline. For the standard, there is a guideline, and that guideline is given here. Now, if you notice over here, it says GVOC S2, GVOC S3. Now, what is GVOC S2 and S3? This is where one should probably be a little smart enough how this has been defined. This is GVOC 1, 2, and 3. So S is standard. For standard 2 and 3, it says legal regulatory requirements regarding cybersecurity, including data privacy, shall be understood and managed. Now, how is that defined? That is defined over here, GVOC S2. Cybersecurity has to be defined. Goal of cybersecurity responsibilities has to be defined. S3 talks about this as well. And then this is where it gets a little tricky. This is applicable for all RE except small and self-certified. Whereas GVOC S2, what you see over here is applicable for all of them. So which means this is applicable for the top 3, whereas this is applicable for all of them. So if you are the top 3, technically these both tables are applicable, right? Now this is where the guideline becomes a little complicated, but it is a one-time exercise of doing this mapping exercise. You should reasonably be able to get clarity in terms of how we are able to approach it, right? So that's that. I hope that gives you that flavor, and this will in turn gets covered into your checklist, whether it is there, not there, etc. One could use solutions like ChatGPT today because it is all available. Upload this, create some, workaround on this, but it is going to be a time-consuming affair. But it is a one-time exercise, and after that it becomes easier. There are companies who are trying to come up with this as a product or a solution. Time will give an answer for that particular statement. Okay, so coming back to my table of contents. So like that, you have something on policy, then you also have on anticipate, identity, risk management. So I'm not going into each of them, as I said. And then comes your structured formats. If you remember, I told you there is a format for VAPT as well, right? This is this. VAPT format, what is the type of entity, intermediary, category, all of those. And then there is a structure mentioned here, annexure. What your VAPT should have is also mentioned here. Auditor's declaration, executive summary, tools used, exclusions, what are the vulnerabilities, risk rating, all of this has to be mentioned out here. Next, it also talks about auditor's declaration, how we should do it, right? Summary, the scope, number of IPs audited, has he audited each of these, right? What are the tools which is used, whether it's an open source or commercial licensed, right? How has he done? Has he done a manual approach, automated, or both, right? Because many of the VAPT reports do not have this. And this is where, if you recollect, the first objective I said is, one of the objectives I said of this framework is to standardize compliance requirements, right? And here is your summary. Now, this is where it becomes a little tricky. You need to mention what are the critical assets, right? What is it? A number of identified vulnerabilities, right? One could use a CV scores or whatever, right? Number of identified closure timelines, open vulnerabilities as on the final submission and auditor's remark, right? Now, you made a mention, somebody was asking, hey, how do I submit this? This is how you actually get going, right? Then talks about penetration testing results. What are the findings? Detailed report about it. Risk rating. What is critical, right? Don't go based on purely CV score. Here you focus on criticality, right? Second, cyber audit report format. This has to be given for every organization other than self-certified RE, right? Even if VAPT is not mandatory, cyber report audit is mandatory. Again, has a bunch of requirements, and it has auditor summary, all of this. And by the way, this is just the table of contents, and it has each and every question answers. To whom, sir, my concern, each of this, whatever I'm seeing, are the broad areas of audit, and then comes specific domains. What are the SEBI circulars, list of IT infrastructure components, right? It talks about what are the number of non-conformities, and then the game gets tricky. Control-wise compliance status. I repeat, control-wise. And here you go based on GVOC S1, GVOC S2. You keep on going until the EVST S5. Just for you to bring in context, we are talking about these numbers. GVOC, within GVOC, there is S1, S2, S1 is standard 1, standard 2, right? So it goes on until what? EVST S5. That means EV strategies, you have S1, S2, S3, S4, S5. It goes until that particular place, right? So you need to report all of those. Sorry. So we were talking about the cyber report format. And then you have your and by the way, these can never be put into a PPT. So this has to be looked into from the annexure or the standard. So that's why I gave you here. And then is your recovery plan template, which talks about how a recovery plan should happen. What is the checklist? What is your containment, right? This again is something which you will have to showcase in case of issue, disaster, etc. Right? So that comes into picture. Now the part 4, as I said, is annexures or audit guidelines, which talks about, right? Now, who should be an auditor? I think here you get your answer, that the auditor should mandatorily be a certain empaneled only, right? Auditor should have preferable, not mandatory, 3 years of experience. Auditor must have experience in areas covered in CCS, CISA, our ISACA certification, CSIM is recognized, right, from ISACA. Then there are other things which is also recognized. Auditor should have IT governance knowledge, must have not have conflict of interest, should have experience in performing VAPT, must compulsory use only license tool, and compulsory have a NDA. So these are few things. Then there's also guidelines, it goes into all of those nuances, right? I'm not going to go to each line by line. If you want any further, they again make a reference to the certain guidelines, right? So here they talk about this. Then how do you do a scenario-based cyber resilience testing? Now, this is something, in fact, I had an opportunity to do it for some of the companies where you pick up scenarios, how you try to test it, was there an attack, how it took place, right? And they've given an attack score. So they've brought a lot of quantification of some of these circulars, right? So the game is getting a little challenging, but at the same time, you need to know cyber world is also getting challenging, right? Guidelines for outsourced organizations, right? If you're outsourced, what are the cyber guidelines? They have given an annexure. Authentication security, right? How do you actually perform? So a lot of interesting things they have actually given as annexures, which talks about, something which you can spend some time and go through it, right? Framework for cloud service providers. This is where I told you in case of SaaS companies, this is a specific framework which they have given. Cyber capability index. Remember, I told you CCI, which talks about 23 broad points based on which a weightage is given, right? So let me quickly take you through one of those points. Security budget. What is the measure? Percentage of organization's information system budget devoted to information security. So if your organization is having X crores, out of which whatever percentage, that is your measurement. So your information security budget divided by total organization's information technology budget multiplied into 100. Is it at least 10 is basically what they are looking at. So that means at least 10% of your organization budget should be focused on information security. If you get that, that multiplied into your weightage score. So hopefully you got an idea how it looks like, right? So then comes your vulnerability measurement. Number of vulnerabilities mitigated divided by number of vulnerabilities identified. You remember I told you this? So that gives you the score. So like this, it runs into about some 20 odd pages. I gave you a summary in a particular nutshell. So I'll not go too much into this. This is the measurement criteria, right? And then is your VAPT scope, your entire scoping. They've given this because many times people ask, hey, what should I scope? Internal or external, right? The most commonly asked question, सबको scope कर लो, right? So they've given this, right? Then is your Efficacy of SOC, your Securities Operations Center. How do I measure the efficacy? They've given a measurement score as well. Not going too much into it. They've just given how these efficacy is measured. Then SOC governance, all of these comes into picture. Then guidelines for classification of cybersecurity incidents. How do I classify these incidents, right? What are low severity, medium, high severity, and how do I report them, right? So that's basically how the guideline is overall structured. All right. So that's, and of course, last you have for a self-certification RE, the simplest of all the players, just give a declaration. In fact, one of my client was saying that I think I should shut shop after reading these regulations. But nevertheless, that is what is the framework, right? So that's how the framework is. So how do I implement, right? The biggest question which all of us have is, what do I do from an implementation standpoint? First is identify the requirements. Which RE you fall under, and therefore what is applicable for you. Unless you do this exercise, there is no way you will be able to decide what is applicable and what you should follow. So please do that first exercise, right? Second, check what is the standard and the requirement. See whether are you following it or not. If no, gap. If yes, go ahead, right? You will have to do that one time exercise. There is no option for you to escape, right? And identify a roadmap, which is priority, which is not priority. Third, develop policies, update procedures, templates, whatever is necessary. Sometimes you also have to have a tool, and sometimes they say you need to have an automated tool for monitoring this, right? So these are examples which you should probably consider developing or building. Next, apply the updated policy, track the performance, and not to forget, periodically monitor, do the VAPTs, do the cybersecurity audit, do the assessments. That is where role of professionals like us are increasingly going to become important. Now, the number of regulated entities will be easily more than 100,000 in India, right? Or if not 100,000, at least about maybe about 75,000 odd. So it is definitely that much amount of potential. But of course, many of them might come under the smaller bucket of self-certification RE. The larger players could be a handful of them, or not, if not handful, at least maybe 1,000 to 2,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 odd players. Yes, there is definitely possibility for professionals to deliver value. And the last slide before I open it up for Q&A is, what are the solutions lined up, right? Or oh, sorry, what are the challenges lined up, beg your pardon, right? So first challenge is, the graded approach is as good as well as bad. Why? Defining who comes under what itself is going to become a challenge. So it is a uniform, but it is graded. So bringing that gap is a challenge. Second, doing some of these security assessments like CCI, STQC audit, all of these things, right? These all become very tricky and it is going to take some time. Third, managing your resources, because you need to upskill your team, you need to bring automation of tools. I think it will take a year or two for things to get matured. Then comes the element of risk management, doing vendor risk assessment, real-time threat detection, asking all of your vendors to showcase compliance. It's going to be a little tricky. Managing data, making sure the data is within India. Of course, there is a relaxation, but assuming tomorrow something comes up, right? Managing that, flexible with what are the guardrails, etc. That is another tricky thing. And not to forget is the timeline, right? Because we have another 2.5 months effectively to implement it. So it's time that we have to prioritize that, right? So that is something which you'll have to keep in mind. So these are fundamentally some of the challenges which we have at this point in time, right? So quick overview about us. We are Ken & Co, a CPA firm, and a CA firm in India, CPA firm in US. Our specialization has been on cybersecurity and technology, and this is where we've been helping most of the organizations navigating the space. And that's about it. Happy to take some questions. I know it's a little bit of a larger topic, which I try to keep you very crisp and precise. But I'll be happy to take some of the questions, because I've given you a high level perspective and also given you some components as to how you could deep dive. Happy to take some Q&A. Any immediate post-migration audit envisaged under the guidelines? I would not see that post-migration audit is envisaged, but I would rather look from an angle of a VAPT that it would insist that it is considered as a major change. So my sense is for you to get a psychological comfort and to be sure, I think migration audit you may want to consider. Are all the IPs or IPs limited to application used by SEBI? I think I clarified this, Gurraj. Internal, external, what is your core product, etc. If you're a larger organization, focus purely on what is in scope for a SEBI perspective. That is how you'll have to delineate it. Does SEBI plan to adapt the framework to keep it updated with emerging AI threats like quantum risks? Yes, Shashank. In fact, there are mentions within the framework of quantum as well, just for you to be aware, right? They've gone ahead and mentioned quantum related elements as well, how one should probably look at it, right? For example, if you look into this, I think the PDF is visible. Yeah, risk assessment, including quantum risks. RE shall environment shall consider these aspects as well. Artificial intelligence is not heavily spoken over here, but I think emerging risk would also meet those. In scope, can we consider critical assets? Santakumar, as I clarified, your critical assets mandatory every year, non-critical assets 25% on a rotational basis. Thank you. Thank you for the lovely feedback. I think we are also sharing the Menti link. So please make sure that you are clicking on that link and giving the feedback. I think my colleagues have sent it across. I know it's a very sometimes a boring, let me be honest, because it's not so very easy to digest a framework and put it into a couple of hours of session. But I tried to my best to bring you the crisp and gist of it. Hopefully this helped most of you. Any other questions? I'll be happy to take it. Otherwise, please make sure you are giving your feedback in the Menti form. We will see how best the recording can be shared across at the earliest. Okay, I think that's about it. I'll just give you one small tip or a mechanism which we had in an we started following, and this might probably just give you some idea. Of course, this is some bit of proprietary information, so I will not be able to share you completely, but just get an idea about it, right? So we started preparing summarized control sheet for us to identify what is applicable to whom. For example, for MII, what is applicable, right? So just filter. Probably I'll just remove all the filters now, right? Now, what is applicable for a qualified RE? Just pick up this. These are the requirements. Of course, we are still trying to see how best we can commoditize it into a tool, but this is where it is started off. And then we go into these guidelines. In guidelines, again, you have qualified RE, what is applicable, choose all of them, and this becomes your bunch of requirements, right? But again, there is a little bit of complication, some sub rules, etc., and things like that. So we have not gone full-fledged into it. This is just to give you a perspective how typically organizations will have to navigate. At the end of the day, it comes into your Excel sheets. Right? That's about it. Thank you so much. Back to the MC, unless if there is any. Are you part of SEBI as part of these activities? No way. I'm not in SEBI. I've not gone into that stage yet. But digesting this, I think probably, I should get into it. Anyways, Joshua is asking an interesting question. Can organization provide evidence that NIST framework is implemented? Joshua, my fear is no, because NIST framework probably will give you 60-70% comfort. There's definitely 30% additional elements like what we spoke of. So that's always something which you'll have to look into it. Hopefully I've answered. I'm not sure what your question is on, Arun. Isaka Bangalore, thank you for organizing. Great. Hopefully you had this. What are the consequences if RE is not able to comply within Q1 25? At this point, Rajiv, nobody knows the answer. We know that generally monetary penalties SEBI can levy. So my suggestion is, in case if you are not able to comply, Again, I'm guessing they might come up with some sort of a relaxation for a month or two, but again, it's very open-ended. If it is something which is substantial, write to SEBI for relaxation of those points, and within 3 months or 6 months, you'll be complying. And at least try to show that you have done this and this is the only thing which is pending, right? So I think that's a good way to look into it. Joshua, in case you have already 60 plus in NIST, great. It's a good starting point. I think you may have to probably, see what more you need to add. Okay. Thank you so much, folks. Thank you for the lovely discussion. And I'll give it back to my good friend, Vardhini. And Vanita ma'am, in case you have something.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Narsimhan. That was a very fantastic session. We all really, really learned a lot. Very insightful. Yep.
Thank you.
And yeah, Vardhani, you can take over and propose a vote of thanks. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So I would like to present the word of thanks for today's session. So on behalf of the Isaka Bangalore chapter, I extend my sincere gratitude to all of you for your active participation and thoughtful engagement throughout today's session. Your presence has made this a truly enriching experience. A special thanks to Mr. Narsimhan for his truly inspiring and insightful presentation. Your extensive expertise and in depth analysis have made this a standout among our CPE events. We deeply appreciate the clarity and thoughtfulness with which you addressed all our questions. And again, a special note of gratitude goes to the Saka Bangalore chapter for organizing this enriching CPE session and fostering continuous professional development within our community. Thank you once again for your time and support. We wish you all a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you,
so much.
Narsimhan sir. Thank you, Vardhani.
Thank you. See ya.